Welcome to the Fear and Greed Saturday edition, the week that was, a wrap of the biggest stories over the past 7 days. I'm Michael Thompson, and good morning, Sean Aylmer.
Good morning, Michael.
Now, Sean, we're changing things up a little bit today. Normally, we would run through the markets, the local and international news, as well as the biggest, most remarkable, sleeper, favourite stories. This morning, we're going to go through the biggest story in each genre. So local news, international news, markets, economics, etc. And then you and I are going to nominate our favourite story, sleeper story, and the most remarkable story. So just changing things up just a little bit. But before we kick things off, a very quick mention of our free weekday newsletter. We've had plenty of listeners signing up in the last week, so thank you very much and welcome aboard to everyone who has. It's an email every morning at 6 a.m, completely free. Sign up at fearandgreed.com.au. Now, Sean, let's get into it. The biggest economic story. I'm not an economist, but even I know that it was inflation this week.
Inflation. It was the week that Australia will look back on and say things changed. Suddenly, we all have to shift to a tightening of monetary policy bias. So what happened, Michael? The Bureau of Statistics released numbers that said that underlying inflation for September was running at 2.4% annualised. That's for the 6th month at an annual rate. That's the highest in 6 years and smack bang in the middle of the Reserve Bank's target range. The Reserve Bank has continually said it won't increase the official cash rate till 2024. It's waiting for a sustained increase in inflation, and that takes a sustained increase in wages. It hasn't seen it until the September quarter, not in wages, but in inflation. When you're smack bang in the middle of that target and there's momentum in prices, you can expect the next quarter to do the same thing and potentially the quarter after. So markets certainly think interest rates will rise sooner rather than later. Commonwealth Bank, AMP Capital both came out this week saying they expected a rate rise in about 12 months' time. That's about 18 months before the Reserve Bank has said it will lift rates. Fixed-term mortgage rates started rising this week. Lenders put their prices higher. It really was the week that was the turning point for inflation in Australia.
Yeah, and of course, that all flowed through then to financial markets as well.
Yeah, when we talk about inflation, it's mostly about the bond market, and that's the case this week. Bond markets predict what interest rates will do in coming quarters and years. And even though the Reserve Bank has said interest rates won't rise until 2024, bond traders just don't believe that. Fundamentally, investors think inflation is a much bigger problem than the Reserve Bank is admitting. Now, the central bank may change its view on Tuesday when its board meets. Other countries, Canada and New Zealand, for example, are already lifting official interest rates. The US, UK and European Union have all shifted their thinking towards lifting interest rates. What's all this mean for investors? Well, if you hold bonds, you're losing out. Prices of bonds are falling because people are selling them, and that's bad news for investors. In fact, the Bloomberg Oz Bonds Composite Index has fallen more than 3% this year. The last time it fell was 1994. Bonds are supposed to be this safe haven asset that you hold and just get this small return all the time. That ain't happening. So that's really the big story in financial markets this week.
Okay, so I know that was the biggest story in markets this week, but can we give a special mention to some of the big moves in local and global shares as well?
Excellent point. There was one day there where A2 Milk fell 12% on the back of a new strategy. That's never good.
Not a good sign, is it?
The PointsBet, the gaming group, that fell 18% after it upped its marketing spend in the US. Remember, this is the group that's already got Shaquille O'Neal working for it. He's got some serious equity in PointsBet. Whitehaven is Australia's biggest coal producer. At one point, its share price dropped 11% after the price of coal dropped slightly. Totally irrational. Mineral Resources, one day it was up 9% after it said it was going to open a lithium mine in the Pilbara region of Western Australia, and the next day it went back 7%. Crazy moves. Also, quick shout out, Tesla in the US. Remember the story earlier in the week where the rental car group Hertz is electrifying its fleet. So what does it do? It orders 100,000 Model 3 Teslas to be delivered over the next couple of years. Suddenly Tesla's share price goes up 10%.
And then Tesla hits the $1 trillion market cap. Pretty spectacular story, that one.
Yeah, it sure is. A really incredible success story, Tesla.
All right, now on to corporate stories. What was the biggest one this week?
The fact that nothing happened at Crown. Now, that sounds silly, but Crown Resorts actually kept its license. The final report of Commissioner Ray Finkelstein was released, and it includes all sorts of bad behaviour, facilitating money laundering, links to organised crime, underpaying taxes, bullying regulators, my personal favourite, woeful corporate governance, something that James Packer, when he appeared before the West Australian Royal Commission yesterday, had conceded. Also, the report said that Crown wasn't protecting problem gamblers, and as the Commissioner put it, it was involved in conduct that was variously illegal, dishonest, unethical, and exploitative. Now, the reason Crown didn't lose its licence is that they were worried that it would damage the Victorian economy and innocent third parties, which is presumably workers. And Crown will be run by a special manager for 2 years alongside the board and executives. The biggest question still is what happens to James Packer's 37%. A recommendation of Finkelstein was that no one owns more than 5% of shares. The idea behind that is that no one will have undue influence on the company. That means James Packer, theoretically, should be selling down, though the Victorian government hasn't actually made that a priority when it's looking at recommendations. So it's not quite clear whether that will happen or not. Undoubtedly, one of the biggest stories of the year is that Crown, despite all these things, kept its licence.
Yeah, absolutely. A couple of quick special mentions, if I can, as well, to ANZ. Reported a $6.5 billion profit, but said it had missed the housing boom, even though it's back on track again now. And also to Macquarie Bank, which made $2 billion for the half year to the end of September. Some big corporate stories, but I agree with you. Crown was the biggest of the week. Okay, turning to international news now, Sean, what was the biggest international story of the week?
Well, there's really only one big international story around at the moment. That's COP26 and the United Nations Climate Change Summit in Glasgow, which kicks off Monday Australian time. Now, I'm cheating a little bit here because I'm including in the international story the deal that the Morrison government did. The Libs and the Nats finally came to an agreement earlier in the week and have put out a roadmap to achieve net zero carbon emissions. Now, in the end, the Prime Minister forced the deal, saying to the Nats that he was going ahead with it whether or not they liked it. Most of them eventually came on board. They did release some details of how they might get there. All sectors are affected by it. There's tens of billions of dollars in spending. Low-cost solar, hydrogen, batteries, carbon capture, they're all big part of the roadmap, and everyone will be better off, the Prime Minister said. I'm not sure about that. I think we still need a bit more information. Anyway, at least it means Mr. Morrison will turn up in Glasgow with a plan. Nations need to turn up in Glasgow with a plan. They need something in their back pocket. Joe Biden claimed he got one, with Democrats agreeing to his $1.25 trillion infrastructure package, which includes big spending on climate change. And that was on Friday morning, Australian time. China, Russia, the US, UK, European Union, even Saudi Arabia are turning up with a plan. So it definitely is the big international story. What will be really interesting in the next few days is what India says, because India is a massive emitter and has no plan, and certainly has not guaranteed that it will get to net zero carbon emissions by 2050.
Yeah, it's going to be a very interesting couple of weeks, isn't it?
Sure is.
Okay, now turning back towards local news, the biggest local story. This was actually a pretty extraordinary story, this one.
Absolutely. Telstra buying Digicel, which is a 3 and 4G network in Papua New Guinea, Fiji, Nauru, Samoa, Tonga, and Vanuatu. What's incredible about it is that they're buying it with taxpayer money. So they're paying $2.1 billion and the government's providing about $1.6 billion of that. That's your money and my money to help Telstra, a private company, buy an asset. Now, Canberra had asked Telstra to have a look at the assets a few months ago. In its view, the government is saying that we're just helping our neighbours out, but in reality, it's probably more about warding off China. Good for Telstra shareholders. They get an asset. Nothing wrong with that. I just don't know that I agree that the government should be using taxpayer money to help a private company to buy an asset and also further Australia's geopolitical goals. It sounds just a touch Chinese to me, Michael. We complain about Huawei and things like that all the time. This isn't much different. Maybe this should have been the most remarkable story.
Yeah, certainly should have been. Possibly even a new category of most controversial. What would have been the alternative for the government to buy it, or just for Telstra to buy it on its commercial merits alone and fund it entirely itself?
Well, I don't think it has commercial merits, because if Telstra is only buying with that much assistance from the government, Australian government probably doesn't necessarily want to fund or own a telecommunications network in the South Pacific. However, it could help. It could provide aid and funding to help the network improve. Theoretically, China could come and buy the assets, so there's no sign that they actually had made a bid for them. But if that was the case, I suppose that's the reasoning the government has. But there's other ways to do it, and one of those is just aid packages to help Digicel get on its feet.
Yeah, it really is a quite remarkable story.
Sure is.
Okay, moving on. What has the COVID news been like this week?
Well, it's pretty good, really, though Thursday was a particularly sad day with 27 deaths announced, 25 in Victoria and 2 in New South Wales. The daily case rates are running at between 15 and 1,900 in Victoria, and New South Wales is most days just under 300. The vax rate is now more than 75% nationally, with the ACT in New South Wales leading the way. Hospitalisation rates are lower. All that's great. And I love the fact that Qantas has released rules for Monday's takeoff. People can travel overseas without getting permission as of Monday. Of course, you'll have to wear a mask the whole way. Can you imagine sitting on a flight from Darwin to London or Sydney to Los Angeles wearing a mask the whole way?
Oh, that would be uncomfortable in the extreme.
It sure would.
Okay, so we've given you the biggest stories of the week. Now we get to the point in the program where we go through the sleeper story, the most remarkable story, and our favourite story. Sean, for you this week, what was the sleeper?
Well, regulation in the buy now, pay later space. The Reserve Bank released a report a week ago that basically said it's time to regulate the sector. One of the reasons the sector has done so well is it's not regulated. So buy now, pay later companies, think Afterpay, Zipco, etc. They promote that consumers don't pay, that actually merchants do that. But the Reserve Bank has come out and said buy now, pay later has to drop its no surcharge rule. So merchants will be allowed to put a surcharge on buy now, pay later payments to recoup the costs. It's not just this change, but the fact that regulators are thinking just a bit differently about the buy now, pay later groups because they're so successful. If buy now, pay later gets caught in credit legislation, for example, it will make it much harder and more expensive to operate. I think this is the beginning of big changes for that sector, and I don't think it'll be anywhere near as profitable as it has been. That's why it's a sleeper story for me.
That is actually a very hard one to beat. But I do have another nomination, but I'm even going into it knowing that it's going to be in second place. It is about the changing nature of retail. And it's a bit of an interesting one, this one, because we mentioned it through the week. It was about Coles launching a new online range of items. They're things that you wouldn't normally buy in Coles. They are kind of refurbished Apple computers and iPads, ovens and kind of other electric goods. It's not the first to do this. Woolworths did it last month as well. But what we're seeing now is Coles and Woolies really embracing the e-commerce boom that's been happening lately and pushing into a whole new area, things that have typically been the domain of other kind of more specialty stores and large chains like Harvey Norman and the like. So it feels to me as though this is a bit of a shift happening within retail, and we'll start to see Coles and Woolies and Aldi and Costco going head-to-head even more online in the near future. So I think it's just a bit of a sleeper story because it's probably one to watch.
I think that's a very good call.
On to the most remarkable story. Now, we kind of had one before that could have been in the remarkable story, and that's the Digicel story. But there is another very, very good contender this week, Sean.
You don't have to be from New South Wales to be absolutely amazed at the ICAC inquiry going in, looking into whether former Premier Gladys Berejiklian breached the public's trust by having an affair with disgraced Liberal MP Daryl Maguire. At the time, she was Treasurer and responsible for granting funding to a bunch of projects in Wagga Wagga, which is the electorate of Daryl Maguire. Now, I tell you what, they were in a relationship for more than 5 years and no one knew. That's remarkable enough. Maguire kept pushing for funding for this clay shooting facility in Wagga. Bureaucrats and others knew he was a pain in the arse, that's the words of former Deputy Premier John Barilaro, but he just kept pushing. He was in the stand on Thursday and he said that he and Ms Berejiklian were talking about marriage and kids. Now, Ms Berejiklian was in the stand on Friday and she agreed with those statements, though she then said she wasn't committed enough to share that, the seriousness of it, with her parents and sisters. and she didn't think she really had to disclose the relationship, notwithstanding she was responsible for handing out money to his electorate. Now, Ms. Berejiklian did say that 2 of her cousins were in the public service. She disclosed that, but not the fact that she was having a relationship with Mr. Barilaro. Some of the tapped phone calls between the two were released yesterday. Ms. Berejiklian said she was soothing Maguire when she told him she got millions for the Wagga Hospital. That was in a phone call she said that. She also said that then Treasurer and current Premier Dominic Perrottet did whatever she wanted. It's a really bad look for Gladys, who a couple of months ago was close to the most popular politician in the country and certainly one of the most popular premiers New South Wales has ever had. Remarkable.
I am completely with you on this one. I think it's been a very uncomfortable spectator sport over the last week in particular and the last few days of the week.
Sure has.
When starting to get into some fairly kind of sordid details. And you are right, Gladys is not coming out of it looking too great. So I agree. That is the remarkable story of the week. Moving on to our favourite story. I think you and I are going to disagree on this one. You go first.
Well, I just love the fact that Fear and Greed spoke about lots of rich and famous people this week. So I'm grouping them all together. Andrew and Nicola Forrest bought Olivia Newton-John's wellness retreat near Byron for $30 million. First time I've ever mentioned Olivia Newton-John's name. The Berrima Jail's up for sale for $20 million. Some of its hosted people like Eddie Obeid, Roger Rogerson, and Lucretia Dunkley. Now, she murdered her husband in 1832 and was executed in the jail and buried standing up. Apparently, she was never allowed to rest in peace, the judge said. So she was buried standing up, but pleased to note the ghost is still there. That's what they say. Michael Jordan's Nike shoes were sold at a Sotheby's auction for $1.5 million. That breaks the record for already worn sneakers. And Tom Brady, arguably the greatest quarterback of all time in American football, he got into a bit of a furor about he threw his 600th touchdown pass, and he said to the fan who ended up with the ball, whoever that was, he would give the fan one Bitcoin, which is worth about $62,000. But then everyone polled in on Tom Brady and said, well, hold on, the ball could go on eBay for about $900,000, so you're being a bit cheap. Point of all this, I love the fact that Fear and Greed are talking about rich and famous people.
It is good. I do feel like you're bending the rules a little bit by actually grouping, 4 or 5 stories in under one category.
Yeah.
And I'm nominating a story that's quite small in comparison, but quite meaningful, I think, to a lot of Australians. And that is the end of the Dolomites, which was the Commonwealth Bank's program that was run through schools to basically introduce and educate children on how banking works. And the corporate watchdog last year ruled that it did not actually help education that much. It certainly did help Commonwealth Bank secure a lot of new customers from a very young age. But this week, we have bid farewell to the Dolomites, and I, for one, am actually quite sad about it.
So it's not your favourite, it's like your least favourite. After 90 years, the Commonwealth Bank will not be in schools anymore.
That's right. And the only category I can put it in, we don't really have an in memoriam segment, so I'm going to have to kind of shoehorn it into my favourite story of the week. So you and I are going to disagree on this one, I suspect.
That's fine. That's a great story, the Dolomite story.
Now, moving on to this week's interviews. On Monday, you spoke to Cameron Brownjohn from Federation Asset Management about investing in ESG.
Yeah, there's so much talk ahead of Glasgow next week that we just thought it was worth having a chat about the best ways to invest in ESG, which is environmental, social and governance. Climate change comes into that umbrella. Really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Tuesday was Zeb Rice from King River Capital, a venture capital group.
He's a great enthusiast, Zeb, particularly about Inner Sydney becoming the Palo Alto of Asia. He is a venture capitalist. He's very well connected with a bunch of startups in Australia. I just like listening to that interview for his enthusiasm, if nothing else.
Yeah, he told some fantastic stories about US politics as well. It's definitely worth going back and having a listen to that one. On Wednesday, Sean, you spoke to Matthew Haupt from WAM Lead as part of the Wilson Asset Management Group.
Yeah, we got his take on large caps on the ASX. We do a lot on small caps. It's not that often that we actually sit and say, which stocks do you like at the big end of town? And that's exactly what Matthew did.
Oh, Thursday, it was all about inflation, of course.
It was. AMP Capital's Diana Messina came on. She talked about why she thinks interest rates will rise in 12 months' time as a result of the Bureau of Statistics inflation figures which came out on Wednesday. Certainly, if you're involved in markets, you should go and listen to that one. And then, of course, Friday's interview I didn't do, you did. John O'Brien from Poolworks, Michael.
Yeah, look, I found this a really interesting chat. Poolworks is a really successful business and they manage basically people's pools for them. John founded the company 25 or so years ago, franchised it, and it's now spreading across the world. Huge success story, really interesting bloke and a really nice guy as well. If you want to listen to that or any of our interviews or indeed any of the shows from the past week, they are all available on your favourite podcast platform or at fearandgreed.com.au. Thank you very much, Sean.
Have a great Saturday, Michael.
Thank you. And don't forget that tomorrow, Sean and I will be back with Adam Lang from the Fear and Greed team to have a bit of a lighter look at some of the news around the place. I'm Michael Thompson. Have a good Saturday and a great weekend.